recording of the webinar and some other resources later this afternoon. Dr. Teddy Potter, clinical professor and director of planetary health at the University of Minnesota's School of Nursing, will be facilitating today's Q&A segment. I am now delighted to introduce our presenters. Anna Rarick is a third-year medical student at the U of M. She is currently in Bemidji for her third-year clinical rotations and hopes to practice some type of primary care once she graduates. Grace Miller is a third-year dual Doctor of Veterinary Medicine and Master of Public Health student. Upon graduation, Grace hopes to use her training in the areas of epidemiology and zoonotic disease surveillance. Both Anna and Grace are involved in leadership for health sciences, in leadership for health students for a healthy climate, an interprofessional student group that focuses on the intersections between climate change and health. I'll now turn things over to Grace and Anna.
All right. Thank you, Molly, for the introduction, and thank you to everyone tuning in this morning, wherever you may be. Today, Anna and I will be talking about the relationship between climate change and health and what you and I can do about it as individuals. So this is a pretty messy and complicated topic. So we wanted to start off the talk with an overview or kind of roadmap of where we're going to be going throughout the talk. So we're going to start with how humans and animals are affected by climate change, and then we're going to move on to how humans and animals contribute to climate change. And then finally, we'll wrap up with how humans and animals can prevent the progression of climate change. So for our roadmap, we're going to talk about the effect of climate change on humans and animals. And Anna is going to start us off with the human health perspective.
Yes, welcome everyone. So as Grace said, I'm going to start out by talking about ways in which human health is affected by climate change. So there are many ways in which human health is affected by our changing climate, but I'm just going to talk about a few of them here. So I'm going to start with heat waves and talk about pollution, and then finish with vector-borne diseases. So as most or all of you know, climate change is causing us to have longer and more intense summers, which we definitely experienced this summer. And then the next few decades, if carbon pollution continues to build in the atmosphere, most of the country could see 20 to 30 days more each year with high temperatures over 90 degrees. And the southeast part of the United States could be hit even harder with having it 40 to 50 more days of heat over 90 degrees. So this is a significant number. With these increased temperatures and more days with them and longer periods of time where we have them, there will be more heat-related illnesses and death. Any of you who have heat stroke know that it's really not fun to experience. You get lightheaded, nauseous, fatigued, and it can take a while for your body to recover. Most of us are able to recover, though. However, there are certain more vulnerable populations that aren't able to deal with heat as well. One of these groups of people is the elderly, because their bodies just don't work as well and they're less able to adapt to changes in the environment. They have a difficult time adapting to heat and are at a higher risk of suffering from heat stroke and mortality related to heat stroke. During the past 20 years, there's been a 53% increase in heat-related deaths in people older than 65. This reached a total of 296,000 deaths in 2018. Another group of people on the opposite side of the spectrum who are more vulnerable to increasing heat are children. They are less likely to realize that they need to get out of the heat and drink water, and they're really reliant on the people around them. So if they don't have people watching out for them, they are at higher risk of heat stroke. And as you can see in these couple graphs here, the important thing is the trend upwards. So in the top graph, with heat wave exposure, we just have more and more people in most countries having higher levels of heat wave exposure. And in the bottom graph, you can see the correlated with that are the increasing number of heat-related deaths. So another group of people who are at higher risk of heat stroke and mortality related to heat stroke are marginalized populations, such as low-income populations and the BIPOC community. Due to a long history of systemic racism in our country, many cities are built in a way where low-income populations and people of color live in areas called heat islands. So you can see in this map of Minneapolis, the darker colors on the left relate to hotter areas of the city, and on the right, those correlate with the lighter colors of income, which are lower income people. So lower income people tend to live in areas that have higher numbers of blacktop, a lot of pavement, and less green space, less trees, and more pollution, all which lead to those areas of the cities being hotter. And people who live in these areas are also less likely to have air conditioning. And all of these things put together put them at higher risk of health complications and even mortality related to heat stroke. There we go. So another area in which health and climate change are really correlated is pollution. And this is a pretty obvious one, but one that's just really important to stress. So air pollution both contributes to and is made worse by climate change. It doesn't take much imagination to realize how this affects people's health. So ambient air pollution results from the emissions of industries and households and vehicles. And fine particulate matter is the most harmful pollutant to human health. It's the tiny little particles in the air that sometimes we can't even see, but they can be really damaging to people's bodies. People who are exposed over time to pollution can have higher rates of lung diseases such as COPD, cancer, and heart disease. It can really affect most parts of your body, all the different systems. And outdoor air pollution is a leading contributor to the environmental burden of disease, and it's linked to over 4 million deaths worldwide each year. The World Health Organization reports that over half of the cities in the world with over 100,000 residents, and 97% of cities in low and middle income countries of that size do not meet air quality guidelines. So this is a really big problem. And similar to heat islands, people with low socioeconomic status are most likely to live in areas with higher levels of pollution. And this means that they just have constant exposure to particles that cause slow damage to their bodies over time. So finally, I'll talk about vector-borne diseases. So vector-borne diseases, or VBDs, are diseases that are transmitted by a vector, which is usually an insect. So these are things like mosquitoes and tick-borne illnesses. Well-known VBDs include malaria, West Nile virus, chikungunya, and dengue fever, which are all carried by mosquitoes. Vector-borne diseases account for more than 17% of all infectious diseases and cause more than 700,000 deaths annually. Rising temperatures, increased rainfall, human migration, and lengthening summers, all made worse by climate change, all contribute to the increased prevalence of vector-borne diseases. So the rise in temperatures across the world lengthens the season of insects that carry disease, and mosquitoes and ticks are better able to live in hotter temperatures. So as more areas of the world become hotter, this expands the geographic range of mosquitoes and ticks so they can live in more areas. Increased rainfall also contributes to an increased number of vector-borne diseases because this creates more sitting water and more breeding areas for these insects. Human migration, which is going to become more and more of a problem in relation to climate change, also results in an increased number of vector-borne diseases because people are moving from areas that don't typically see these diseases to areas that do, and these people have less immunity to these conditions. And finally, the lengthening summers leads to longer breeding seasons for mosquitoes and ticks, which means that they can just survive for longer periods of time and infect more people. So you can see in this top graph, these are the rates of dengue and malaria, and both of these are increasing and have been increasing for many years due to increasing temperatures and rainfall. So I've been talking about mosquito-borne illnesses, which isn't as relevant to us here in Minnesota, but tick-borne illnesses such as Lyme disease are very relevant to us. And these are another group of illnesses that are increasing in prevalence due to climate change. So the incidence of Lyme disease in the United States has nearly doubled from 1991. And similar to mosquitoes, the life cycle of ticks is really strongly influenced by temperature. So as the temperatures are rising, they're living for longer periods of time and can expand into more areas. You can see in this bottom graph, it's the change in Lyme disease incidence in the Midwest, Minnesota and Wisconsin, and in the Northeast. And this is an increase in cases across all of these areas. And Lyme disease may seem like not a huge deal. It doesn't affect a lot of people in huge ways. They might get a bullseye rash and not much else, but it can really be a debilitating disease for a lot of people. It can cause heart block and severe joint pain, and can be a chronic condition for people. So this is something that we really need to address and can't be ignored.
All right, so now I am going to talk about the animal health perspective, so how climate change affects animals. So animal health is a pretty broad category. And so pets, wildlife, our food, aquatic fisheries, and aquaculture systems are definitely affected by climate change. But for the sake of the simplicity of this talk, I'm going to narrow down to just terrestrial food species. Go ahead, Anna. So this paper published in 2017 by Myers et al. Did a really great job summarizing the effects of greenhouse gas emissions on our global food systems. And I wanted to talk about this in the context of global food systems because our food animal species are within our food systems and have such a large impact on it. And so this diagram has a lot going on, but ultimately what it's showing is that greenhouse gas emissions have layers of complexity and consequences that ultimately lead to altered nutritional status of our food. And food animal species fit into one portion of that diagram, which I've outlined in green and zoomed in on. And so climate change effect on our food animal species is similar to what Anna's been talking about. So they also experience increase in vector-borne diseases, emerging infectious diseases, pollution, and heat stress, as seen in this illustration. But in addition, there's also changes in forage composition and productivity of forage, altering the nutritional status of their food, all of which leads to an altered livestock productivity, which means that, for example, a dairy cow under heat stress will not produce as high a milk yield as a dairy cow not under heat stress. You can advance, Anna. So we're going to zoom in specifically in the Midwest. And this 2020 paper published by Christ et al. Summarized the research currently being done on extreme weather events and the effects that it has on our animal agriculture here in the Midwest, which we will personally be experiencing increased flooding events. And so the middle image gives the summary of some of the consequences that extreme flooding events have on animal agriculture, specifically beef and swine. So we see reproductive changes, carcass quality changes, environmental changes, biosecurity challenges, acute mortality, all within that will impact Minnesota. And for those that don't know, Minnesota is the second highest producing swine producer in the country and the #1 turkey producer in the country. And so this is going to have an immediate impact on our agriculture sector and our economy. So you can advance, Anna. And so now, Anna, we're going to be talking about animal and human contributions to climate change, and she's going to start us off.
So again, there are obviously many ways in which humans are contributing to climate change. Almost everything we do is contributing in some way, but I'm just going to briefly go over the way the United States in particular is responsible for our worsening change in climate. So human activities are responsible for almost all of the increase in greenhouse gases in the atmosphere over the past 150 years. And as you can see in this graph, some countries have a lot larger contributions than others. And the United States is here in the light blue, and we're one of the biggest contributors to greenhouse gases in the world. So I'll just talk briefly about where our emissions are coming from, because it gives us an idea on where reductions in emissions could have the most impact. So the primary source of greenhouse gas emissions in the US is from transportation at 29% of our emissions. And this is mainly coming from cars, trucks, ships, planes, trains. And over 90% of this fuel is petroleum-based. Electricity production is second at 25% of our emissions. And this is mainly coming from burning fossil fuels like coals and natural gas. And coming in third is industries with 23% of our emissions. And these are also mainly coming from burning fossil fuels. So these are the three main contributors, but there are a couple other areas that have significant contributions as well, and that's in businesses and homes, more commercial and residential, and agriculture, mainly from livestock and crop production. And contribution to climate change is also a big equity issue. As you can see, this is starting to become kind of a theme with climate change. Developed countries have, as you can see from the previous graph, have contributed the most to climate change. Yet people in developing countries who do not have access to as many resources are typically affected the most by the growing effects of climate change. So this leads us to an important question, which is, who should have the biggest role in combating climate change? Should it be the people who are most affected by it, or the people who have contributed the most? And that's kind of a rhetorical question, but I'll just leave you to think about that.
All right, so now we're going to transition to the animal contribution to climate change. So at this point, I don't think it's a mystery or wild to say that animal agriculture contributes to climate change. It does. There's nothing inherently wrong with animal agriculture, but to the degree that we are using it. So globally, our population is growing at an exponential rate. Additionally, larger percentage of people are using animal protein as their main source of protein in their diet. And so that's both of those two things combined together are putting extreme pressure on animal agriculture to produce high yields, which are in turn leading to climate change. And so this image, very small fine print, but I will give the summary, is that animal protein based products have a larger carbon footprint than our non-animal products. As you can see, with the beef is 25 carbon dioxide equivalents, pork 6.5, and beans at 0.65. This is an average, so it changes drastically depending on the farm and the system that's being used, but in general, on average, it requires more resources to produce our animal proteins. As we talked about earlier with the dairy example, so climate change also has an effect on this. So as I mentioned earlier, the dairy cow under heat stress does not produce as high of a milk yield. So it requires 2 dairy cows under heat stress to equal potentially the milk yield of a dairy cow not under heat stress. And so with climate change and the consequences of climate change, we're using even more resources to get the same productivity from our animal agriculture. And so we're kind of in this cycle, and they're intertwined, and we can't talk about one without talking about the other. And now we're going to transition to how we can mitigate and prevent climate change through our actions.
So trying to be environmentally conscious and can feel really futile at times, especially because climate change is just such a big problem and we're only individual people. But there are many ways that we can make changes within our own lives and take action to make at least a small difference. And, you know, if a lot of people are all taking small actions, this can lead to bigger changes. So we're going to talk about ways that we can take action on a small scale, a medium scale, and a large scale. And a lot of these things you may have already thought of or may already be doing, but I find it's always a good reminder and a motivator to talk about these things out loud because it can really encourage us to take more action. So on a small scale, we can make many changes to our own lives that have a positive impact on the environment. A lot of these changes really involve us just being more intentional about our choices on a day-to-day basis. So one of these ways is by our food choices, which Grace has kind of already touched on, but the food we eat is a huge way in which we can have an impact because we're constantly eating. You don't have to become a vegan or a vegetarian, but you can be just more conscientious about what you're eating each day. So trying to eat less meat and more white meat, for example. But you can also think about where your food is coming from. So did it have to travel on a plane to get here, or is it from a more local area, which would create a lot less emissions? And this can be a little tricky to think about when you're in the grocery store and buying a bunch of different foods, but if you're intentional about trying to constantly think about this, it can almost become routine. Another way in which you can make small scale changes is through waste production and disposal. So make sure to recycle whenever you can and learn the proper rules for recycling because it can be kind of complicated. And just try to produce less waste in general. And again, this can relate back to food because we produce a lot of food waste in the United States. So just think more about how much food you're buying so you don't end up throwing away as much. And also see if you can compost because this can result in a lot less waste. Transportation can be a tricky one, especially living in Minnesota where it's cold for half the year and in a pandemic, which could make it less safe to use public transportation. But if it's possible to bike or ride share with people, this can be a really great way to reduce your carbon footprint. And finally, if you have any investments, be really intentional about which companies you're investing in. And this can be on the level of which stores you're buying from and choosing to support, or if you are investing in stocks. You can do research pretty easily on how much companies are contributing to emissions and how much they're doing to combat their emissions. So many companies are trying to become carbon neutral or invest in renewable energy, and these are great companies to support over companies that are not being as intentional about these things.
And then I wanted to quickly hop on and talk about the animal side. It's kind of difficult since we're humans to have a direct impact on changes that animals can have to mitigate climate change. So most of the changes happening within the animal sector are the result of research, and as citizens, we don't really partake in that. Some research that is being done that I found was interesting is like UW-Madison is looking into selecting for traits that are more environmentally friendly. So like we've selected for certain physical traits in species, in our domestic species for thousands of years, we're now looking towards cows that produce less methane and things like that. And just making our agriculture more sustainable long-term for the higher yields that we're going to need. But as individuals, like Anna mentioned, food choices, so buying locally, and then if you personally know that a producer invests in greener practices, then obviously giving your money to them. But yeah, other than that, it's difficult, so.
So on a medium scale, I like to think of medium scale changes as looking around at your workplace and seeing what changes could potentially be made there. But this can also apply to other places around you as well. So, businesses you visit on a regular basis, or influencing your friends and relatives to take action in their own workplaces. So being aware of what your workplace or other businesses around you are doing to contribute to or combat climate change is the first step, and then you can encourage change. So look into what energy sources your workplace is using. What percent is coming from fossil fuels and what percent is coming from renewable energy. Investing in renewable energy can actually really pay off for companies in the long run. Also look into whether your workplace recycles or has compost. If they don't, this can be a really pretty easy change to make. Another thing you can look at is ways you can reduce waste production within your workplace. So is it possible to replace plastic silverware and plates with reusable ones that people can wash? Or can the amount of plastic be reduced in other ways? This is another way in which you can make kind of simple changes that can go a long way. And finally, look at whether your company encourages ride sharing or using public transportation. They could provide an incentive for people to ride share or give out yearly bus passes. This is another pretty small, easy change that can result in a lot of change. So these are just a few areas to start to think about within your workplace or other areas around you. And it may seem difficult to make changes on this larger scale, but many of these changes, as I've said, can be really simple. So try to figure out if there's a person within your workplace that you can talk to about some of these potential changes, and really stress that it will look good for your company, because in the long run, it truly will and can attract more people to work there. So on a large scale, this is more policy level changes. Policy changes, as a lot of you probably know, are going to be really important in the coming years, and they're going to have by far the biggest impact on how quickly climate change is going to progress. This can seem completely out of our hands at times, but there are many ways in which we can engage in advocating for better climate policy. So first of all, just keep up with the news. Make sure to stay on top of bills that are going to be moving through the legislature. Can happen even this legislative session, but it's also a good possibility that a lot of these policies are going to be taken out of bills that are moving through the legislature. So it's really important to learn about these. And as many of you may know, COP26 is currently happening in Glasgow, Scotland, and this is the United Nations yearly conference on climate change, where world leaders are gathering to talk about ways in which they can combat climate change. So stay on top of what they're talking about, learn more about what changes different countries are making, and then push for changes that our own country can make. So when you're more familiar with these current policies and potential policies, it puts you in a good position to reach out to your legislators. And again, this can be on the state level and the national level. It may not seem like it at times, but our legislators are really there to listen to their constituents. That's what their job is. So it's important to reach out to them. And you can do this in a lot of ways. You can call them, write letters, set up meetings with them. You can be as personal as possible. That's really the way to go. And once you are able to contact them, make the issue personal to yourself and to the people around you. And this will make your contact with them a lot more meaningful and memorable. And having a specific ask is really important. So ask them to support a specific piece of legislation or speak out against or for something publicly. And this is why keeping up with the news is so important, because it can allow you to have a more informed conversation with your legislators. Finally, get info out to the public so more people can be informed about this topic and more people can then reach out to their legislators and advocate for change. A great way to do this is by writing LTEs, or letters to the editor, or op-eds in your local paper. And if you see an article written about in the paper, it can be good to write a letter to the editor in response to this article. That will make it more likely to be published. And similar to talking to legislators, you want to make it personal. Talk about why this issue is important to you, and then include a specific ask. You can call out legislators in your letters to the editor, or ask people around you to reach out. And using health as a main argument is a really great way to make this issue personal in all these ways. And the topics we've talked about today in this webinar are great things to bring up, because health affects everyone. It affects humans, it affects animals. And if you can relate health to climate change in your letters to the editor, in your meetings with your legislators, then you can really make it personal to people and help them understand why this issue is so important. The bottom line, by taking any of these actions on a small scale, a medium scale, large scale, mix of all of them, you can really help our planet move in a better direction and work towards the health of people and animals.
We wanted to end with this quote: "The health of soil, plant, animal, and man is one and indivisible," similar to what Anna just said. You can't have human health without animal health, and vice versa. And it can be complicated and messy, and you would definitely be under the category of a wicked problem. But if there's anything you can take away from our talk today, is that as individuals, we have more power than it would seem, and your individual actions do make a difference. So thank you all for coming. If you have any questions, our resources are at the end of the slide. You can also email us if you're interested in any of these references. Yeah, and I think we're doing a Q&A. So yeah, excited to hear any questions.
We are doing a Q&A. So I've hopped in, and I hope you will all join me in celebrating these wonderful future health professionals. We're so fortunate to have them learning their profession and embedding climate change and other environmental concerns into their work. So thank you so much. We did have several questions that came in, and the first one I'm going to address to Anna. It's the idea of microplastics. It's not really a question, it was a statement about, we see that now microplastics can be found in newborn stool samples. And so we know that microplastics are like everywhere. So the question I'm gonna tack onto this comment is, how can we be conscious consumers and really understand that single-use plastics are not the way to go?
It's a really good question. And I think it can be tough sometimes to think about these things and put them into action, because single-use plastics are really easy to use and they can make things just a lot quicker and easier in our day-to-day busy lives. But kind of what I mentioned earlier about being really intentional about what you're using each day can almost become a routine. So if you make this a goal to use, you can buy forks and spoons and plates that you can even bring around with you, to bring them to work, bring them wherever you're going, and use them, wash them, rather than using the plastic silverware plates that are produced. That's, something pretty simple that you can put into a routine in your day-to-day life and really reduce the amount of plastic you're using. You can also bring containers to the grocery store and use bulk products, put them into your containers rather than buying things that are packaged in plastic that you buy every week. These are just a few things that you can do, but I definitely encourage everyone to research ways in which you can reduce your plastic waste, because again, if a lot of people do this, that can really make a big difference.
That's great, thank you. And also there's utensils and plates, et cetera, made from plants that are now quite effective. In the beginning, they were just terrible. You'd go to cut something and it fell apart in your hands or it dissolved before it even got there. But the science of plant-based products has grown exponentially. So I do trust them. If you're hosting a large gathering, you can serve compostables and they are safe and effective, and they send a really strong message that you're serious about this. So Grace, my question for you is, we also need to be thinking about climate change in pets. You talked about large animals, but many of the people on this call maybe don't own a cow. So what do they need to be thinking about with their dogs, cats, other household pets related to climate change?
It's very similar to our own health because we live similarly. We have similar lives because they live under our roof. So we take our dogs on walks together, and we're living in the same environment. And so often the effects are same. So issues relating to pollution, as Anna talked about with asthma, cats get asthma, and it can be environmental allergens, and added pollutants in the air can make it worse. As well as heat stress on our dogs and cats, taking your dog out on a walk and they can't sweat. So their paw pads and their ears are where they let most of their heat go, as well as panting. And so when their paw pads are on the hot sidewalks, that can affect them. And so often the similar solutions to our health problems are going to mirror in our pets, which is another reason why I didn't pick pets, because it aligns and is very paralleled with human health.
Thank you. And I think sometimes we forget that.
Mm-hmm.
I think people will leave their pets in the cars in the hot summertime or under heat, and they just don't even think about it. Hopefully they'll think about leaving their child strapped in the car seat, but they're a lot more common to leave their dog in a hot car while they run in for groceries. And that's a real problem with this growing heat episodes. Is there a list of eco-friendly stores? I think you've convinced people that we now need to be moving in this direction. So what would you recommend? How do we begin to start to find stores and businesses that we can support?
I know if you live in the city, there's co-ops that are great. I know it's difficult because then you could get into the discussion of food deserts and all these things, and people who don't live in areas where maybe they don't have access. And I'm sure there can be some guilt with that, where maybe they can't afford these organic or better products. They can't go to a farmer's market because things are more expensive. But shopping locally, if you can and can afford it. In the email Molly's going to send out at the end, we put in some resources where people can look to buy locally. And so that'll be coming after this presentation. But if you cannot afford it, don't be guilty. And the people who can afford it should be doing that, so that maybe someday it'll be more affordable for everyone and greater access.
Yeah, I just want to echo that. I think there is a term for that. It's greenwashing. So similar to whitewashing, greenwashing is doing that, talking about what we can do to be more sustainable and shop well. And like Grace said, that's not a possibility for everyone. So being really intentional about how you're talking about these things with your friends and family, because some people may not have the ability to be as intentional because of monetary reasons.
Thank you for being so sensitive to the wide variety of people in our community, because solutions have to be ones that we can all participate in and not just some who have advantages. So thank you both for that. I think that greenwashing piece is really, really important to pay attention to, because people are beginning to wake up. We need to be making sustainable choices. We need to be caring for the planet and drawing down our CO2. And so products are being produced that say, good for the environment, good for the earth. when in fact, they really aren't. You look at the amount of packaging they use, or that they are shipped from way across the ocean. So there are some practices we need to get into our habits as consumers of really buy locally as much as possible, not just to support farmers and business owners locally, but also to decrease our carbon footprint during the shipping process. If we can get apples from Minnesota, there's no sense in having our apples shipped from California. And to think about that every time we buy something, about our products being used. And you two are such wonderful role models for those decisions and the language that you use. Somebody asked a question about our fashion industry, and if you would comment about that and its impact on the planet.
Yeah, I think fast fashion is becoming more and more of a thing, and where you're buying things and almost expecting to only wear them a few times and then throw them away. And I really wasn't aware of this until quite recently, but there are entire companies that's what they do. They produce clothes that are not very well made, with the expectation that they'll be used a few times and thrown away. And this really contributes to an enormous amount of waste. So also being intentional. There's a theme here of just being intentional and thinking about all of your choices, but about where you're buying from. And just with a little research, you can go a long way in figuring out what companies might be better to support. And I saw someone just said, shop at a thrift store. That's a great idea, because that's just completely reusing things, not even buying anything that's been produced and then shipped somewhere. So there are many ways in which you can not participate in fast fashion. And again, I want to acknowledge that can be difficult for some people who do not have the monetary resources, because buying better clothes can also be more expensive. But if you have the means, really be intentional about what type of clothes you're wearing.
And I think we don't have to sit around and wait for industry to change. We can drive change. So stores really pay attention to what we request and ask of them. If there's certain products that we want to see highlighted. So you can begin to start to see big box stores really starting to respond to consumer-driven choices around organic foods and foods with less packaging. There are some programs I would urge people to look at the ugly fruit movement, in that oftentimes fruits that have an odd shape or strange color, or maybe a small blemish that doesn't affect its ability to be eaten, don't make it to the grocery store and get thrown away. And so we need to be looking into that and encouraging grocery stores to carry products that are ugly. that's okay. So it's again consumers driving these changes. I have a great question here, and I'd love to hear what you two think about that. And that is that the fossil fuel industry continues to hold a lot of sway both in our nation and around the world. It is still subsidized by a lot of governments, so that they're not only are they making money, they're being given money. And what are your thoughts about new pipelines, new forms of fossil fuels continuing to open, and what we need to do about that?
I think it similarly comes down to, as individuals, our biggest power is consumer power. And so avoiding using fossil fuels, that's what's driving the market and driving the pipelines, is ultimately we continue using it in day to day. And obviously the big companies have our individual impacts are not like driving a car with fossil fuel isn't as great as a company that uses fossil fuel, but changing in any way that we can our consumer habits, as well as protesting, is a great way to get involved in reaching out to legislators and sharing your opinion on the matter.
Yeah, I fully agree. I think that if you haven't been involved in advocacy before, this is a great time to get started because there are many very relevant issues here in Minnesota, like the Lyme 3. And this is an instance where a lot of this pressure has fallen on the Native American population to defend their own land. And this is a marginalized population, and it shouldn't be their job just themselves to defend their land and to fight against this. So we need to support their voices, raise up their voices, and really fight against this and encourage our legislators to also speak out against it, because I know that that has been an issue in the past few months, that we have legislators that aren't voicing what their opinions are on this. And it's really important to push them to speak out against it.
And they don't speak against it if they feel that most of the people in their district that they're hearing from are the ones that want to keep old patterns in place. So it really is necessary for us to speak out and say, we've got a problem here, and we're really contributing to threats to future generations, and we need to take action now. The more they hear from us, the more they'll realize, oh, okay, I can vote in this direction or take leadership in this direction because that's what my constituents are asking of me. So there were some questions about lots of sharing in the question and answer area, but also in the chats area of recommendations. And that's what I would like to encourage all of you to realize, is that our greatest resource is each other, and really get into not just book clubs, but start swapping ideas of what lifestyle clubs, or how do we make choices that affirm the health of the planet, because there's just wonderful ideas here, and sometimes there are things that you haven't thought of. Again, back to being a consumer that can pressure change. I use this simple example. Out in Berkeley, California, the Target bags are not plastic, they're compostable. So we know that it's absolutely possible. It happened because the people living in Berkeley said, we do not want to be using plastic anymore. And they developed a city ordinance, and sure enough, the bags are now compostable and they don't fall apart. They do get home and they do work on, at a future date. So they're really good bags. And they are a Target, Target brand. So it is possible for us to change things. We just need to continue to be putting pressure on companies and asking and saying, look, I want to continue to shop here, but I need to be able to do that without contributing to environment problems. There's also a question about, is there a single action that you think people would take that would have the biggest impact?
It's a good question and a tough one. I don't know do you have a good answer to that, Grace?
I'll give an answer while you're thinking.
Action. I think reaching out to legislators is probably if you're going to pick one action that had the largest impact, I think that if we all did that, I think that would have the greatest potential for change.
Yeah. Paul Douglas, one of our meteorologists, talks about we're all looking for a silver bullet, and it's actually going to require buckshot. We're going to have to approach this in many, many, many different ways. And the ways that align with where you have some natural networks and influence are the ways to get involved, whether it's teaching young children about what they can do to live sustainably, whether it's making sure that we protect our elders, whether it's caring for our livestock and animals and making sure that the U.S. Department of Agriculture hears very, very strongly from us that this is a climate emergency. Whatever sort of angle you want to take, we all need to take it now, absolutely. Which brings us to a question that is, what are you two going to do using, how are you going to use this in your profession once you're in practice?
Great question. So I am acutely aware that once I have an MD behind my name, I have more power, which I don't really like, but I think it's really important to be aware of that and use that for good. And that can apply to a lot of people probably on this call. The more education you have, the more power you tend to have and the more voice you have, which again is a problem, but you can use that for good. And as a physician, I want to definitely continue to be involved in advocacy, use my voice to spread information, spread correct information. And also, I think that just talking to my patients about these issues is going to be important, because as we've talked about these different health concerns and health related to climate change, I'm going to be seeing people who have heat stroke. I'm going to be seeing people with Lyme disease, and engaging in conversation with them about why we're seeing higher levels of these will, cause them to go talk to other people about it and can really spread a lot of good.
Yeah, I think I don't at this point plan on practicing, but if I was, I guess one of the benefits of being in practice is you see so many people every single day, and you have the opportunities to have these discussions every single day. And just as in humans, dogs get Lyme disease as well, and it manifests similarly and is a chronic, serious condition. And so that is a perfect talking point to bring this up. And I feel like veterinarians have a very interesting role because we see the owner, the human, and then we also have our client and then our patient, who is the animal. And so we have a unique position of like discussing the connection between human and animal health and the impacts vice versa.
So glad you two are going to be out in practice and out in the world and helping to impact. It's just wonderful. There was a question that came in, and I'm going to take the moderator's liberty to answer that. And then I'm going to end with two questions for the two of you. And the question was, at what point are we past mitigation and need to focus on adaptation to irreversible changes? And my response would be never. We know from the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report, that any little tiny increase in temperature has huge impacts. So we have to do all that we can to continue to mitigate this crisis, to continue to draw down CO2. Absolutely, absolutely. With everything we have, every ounce of ability, power, influence that we have, to continue to fight against this threat to human survival. In the meantime, we also have to be adapting, especially communities and people who are most vulnerable. And so it's not an either or, it is an absolute urgency to be doing both. And I hope all of you can feel that and hear that this is not just a call to environmentalists or health professionals. This is a call to every single human being to step forward and do all that we can to ensure a different future, a positive future. And we have about a decade to really be working on this before, as the questioner mentioned, we really get ourselves into spaces with irreversible damages to the planet. So two final questions that I want to ask our two wonderful speakers. One is, as you see COP26 unfolding, what are you feeling? What are you thinking? What are you feeling when you are watching what's happening?
You can go first, Anna.
I'm feeling cautiously hopeful, I would say. I think that I was actually able to attend COP23, so quite a few years ago, but being there surrounded by so many people who care so much about making environmental change and protecting our world was a really wonderful feeling. There are so many people fighting for change, and I don't want to be too excited about it, because I think that politics can be really tricky, and that's what it is. It's all these world leaders coming together, but they are there for a reason. And I think that people are really starting to realize that we don't have much time. So I am hoping that can spur a lot of action coming out of COP26.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, I would agree with Anna. It's hopeful, but we've been in situations where there's a lot of talk, so we'll see. See if there's action.
Yeah, I'm just going to chime in that I'm hopeful that the trees have shown up, that the countries have committed to protecting our forests, because they are one of our greatest carbon sinks, one of our greatest solutions. We'll see if people act upon those commitments, and we're going to have to hold our leaders' feet to the fire about this. But you committed to protect the trees, let's go for it. And then my final question for the two of you is, what gives you hope?
I think seeing all the people on this webinar gives me hope, and just seeing so many people who are so passionate about this issue and want to fight for change and protect those who don't have a voice. And yeah, I just think every day I see people who are really thinking about these things and wanting to make a difference, and that gives me a lot of hope.
Thank you. Grace?
Yeah, I mean, since I was young, and I'm not that old, I'm only 26, like there's already been the changes from when I was growing up to now are dramatic. Like composting wasn't a thing. It wasn't a thing. And now in St. Paul, you can get curbside composting. And so in that amount of time, 15 years, we've had a pretty dramatic change. And so that gives me hope that now it's kind of like the snowball effect, where it starts really small and it's getting bigger. And I feel like that snowball it's growing in size, and it's going to faster and faster. And we're going to start seeing more change at a faster rate on a larger scale. So that gives me hope.
I can relate to that. When I first started as a climate activist, I felt a little bit like Chicken Little running around saying the sky was falling, and people didn't understand it, didn't see the urgency, didn't see that it was an issue. And it certainly is, people are participating right now. So my greatest hope is young leaders like you. I have heard you mention and thread through your conversation, not only climate change, but words of equity, words of deep respect, profound understanding that animals need to be protected as much as humans. I mean, we're in really good hands knowing that you folks are coming forward as leaders. So I'm going to turn it over to Molly for some closing words, but thank you so much for being our teachers today.
Yeah, thank you so much, Anna and Grace, for your contributions and insights, and to Teddy for facilitating such an insightful conversation. We hope that you will join us at future upcoming well-being webinars. And as I shared previously, we will send out a post-webinar email this afternoon with a recording, so you can rewatch the webinar, share it with friends or colleagues. And we'll also provide a number of resources for you to dig deeper into this topic. So I hope everyone has a great afternoon, and thanks again for joining us.